Taking a look at Sorceress on day 1 of a new ladder season. For hardcore, I think there's 2 approaches that are the best. Either you go for Mephisto, which is what I like to do, or you can go Lightning Respec and do Arcane. In this case, whatever playthrough spec you choose depends if you're playing solo or group. I typically play Blizzard most of the time, it's just the easiest for me. But when I finish the game in Hell, I'm gonna respec into whatever I'm going to farm. So let's start off with the Arcane in this case. Going to want... I forgot teleport. The main thing here is you want to focus on ghosts as much as possible and skip the ghouls entirely. And you want to line monsters up as much as possible, so you can use lightning instead of chain lightning for the better casting frames. Once you get more skills, your damage becomes good enough, you can stick to using only chain lightning. At this early point, my damage is so poor I would skip Summoner entirely. It's just not worth the time. Now as for the second approach, for Mephisto I prefer to go Firewall. I think it's really the best option. It's just a 60-point build, which means you can start at relatively low levels. And as you gain more levels, you get to have spare points to invest into Energy Shield and Telekinesis for a bit more safety. As you can see, I have struggled to keep my mercenary alive. I had to use 1 Rego, and that's in spite of him having 20% PDR. As a hardcore player I much prefer to use the Biomerc, but you might have to start off with the Defiance Merc since he's much better at tanking Mephisto. But as soon as you get a few PDR pieces, like you could have high roll safety crafts on these 2 slots, he should be able to survive with some help from you feeding him potions. Just important that you start giving him health potions as soon as you see his bar going down a bit. As for the gear on the Sorceress, either approach, it's pretty much the same. I'm always going to be using a Spirit Sword. I think crafted orbs, you need to get really lucky to get something better than a Spirit Sword, because early on you really need the cast rate it provides, and orbs, you only get like 15 to 20 cast rate without an affix. On top of that, Spirit also provides a decent chunk of mana and a nice chunk of faster hit recovery. So I prefer to save my topuses, I mean amethysts, for crafting gloves, belts and later amulets. In this case I got really lucky on the caster craft bell and landed 20 FCR, but you can get by with a 10 cast rate. Let's say your spirit is a low roll, you would just have to combine cast rate on these 4 slots to still be hitting the 63 breakpoint. 10 cast rate gloves you can purchase at the vendor. Other slots, in this case I'm using smoke as a chest to cover resistances. 3 Topaz helm, I think it's mandatory on day 1, there's nothing better. If you haven't found the base during a Nightmare playthrough or doing Nightmare cows, you can pop a dual arena at Larsak in Hell. It'll only take you a couple of minutes to get a Great Hellmouth crown from him. Shield, I prefer Rhyme. Gives you some block, cannot be frozen res, magic find. I decided to invest in Dex because I think block is good, but I wouldn't go 75 block here because it just takes too much off your life pool. I think about 50% is good. If you don't have the base again for that, like a Grim Shield or a Tower Shield, you can purchase a 2-socket Bone Shield in Act 2, normal difficulty by Drogden. Should only take a minute or 2. As for the other approach to running Mephisto, you could go Frozen Orb, but it's a lot harder, especially at the beginning at low skill levels. The damage is just low and you have to really hit the target right on the spot, which is difficult with the Mercenary because the range is longer than the leash, so he starts running off, and in the case I'm using a Biomerc, he's also using Whirlwind, so Mephisto is moving about. But it's a viable option if you want to be able to do more than just Mephisto runs, which is basically all you're doing with a Firewall spec. Some early upgrade choices. If you're playing Firewall from Mephisto, it's 3-piece Talrasha set. The 3 easiest pieces to find you can get pretty quickly from running Mephisto. The nice thing here is the minus 15 enemy fire res, apart from the MF, and that decent chunk of life. It's quite a decent boost to your damage, the 15 piercing as Mephisto. I think it's important if you're running Mephisto to do the Topaz chest swap. It just gives a really nice boost to your MF and will give you much more drops initially. As soon as your res are where they need to be, you could just be using it permanently. But right when you're starting off, you most likely will have to just swap it in for the last hit. Once you've found a bit of gear from Mephisto, you could transition into running Chaos, respec into Frozen Orb. But you need a pretty decent mercenary setup to be able to tank and handle the Cold Immune Seal boss. I'd prefer to run an Act 2 Defiance mercenary with Reaper's Toll. He's much more tanky, and the AI of the Bio mercenary is a bit stupid sometimes, so it's difficult to make him actually kill Lord Viserys. But you need some pieces like a decent weapon, maybe not Reaper's Toll, but a decent pole armor of some kind. A nice PDR helmet like Rockstub or Vampire Case. And I would say a decent block shield like Withstance on the Sorceress, or maybe a Craft. And something like a 3 Cold Skill Amulet to boost the damage. And ideally a Wizard Spike as well, at least for hardcore. So after having farmed LOD content for a while, Mephisto, Chaos, Arcane, what have you, here's a quick look at going into maps as Frozen Orb, which I think is one of the stronger specs on a pretty budget setup. I'm using an Oculus, Shaco, 3 Gold Amulet, B-Magi, Storm Shield, Silkweave in this case, a Ravenfrost, a Rack, Castrate Ring, and my gloves are Occultist because it shortens the duration of amplified damage. I have a full set of Cold Skillers, a Sorcerer's Torch. You can definitely start maps with less than this, but I would prefer to stay in Chaos until you have gear similar to this. As you can see, I have a pretty decent 180 MF. Wrist just barely capped, 78 breakpoint for Frozen Orb, 42 hit recovery. I have a Call to Arms offhand, which is necessary because I'm running an Act 2 mercenary. As you can see, my life is only a mere 850. Reaper's Toll Merc, Delirium for crowd control, Leviathan for tanking, String of Ears for tanking, Laying of Hands for attack speed leech, Marowak for Cannot Be Frozen. Your top 4 map choices early on: Horizon's Memory, Ancestral Trial, Phlegathon, and Royal Crypts. Most of these are pretty easy as Frozen Orb. Phlegathon is maybe the only one that potentially has some pretty dangerous ranged mobs sometimes. Let's take a look at the trial run. And here's a showcase of Frozen Orb with an endgame setup. This is not too far off perfect. Again, in this case I have a Fathom with a Cast Rate Slam. I'm using Atmos, Cast Rate Slam, 2 code facets, Maris, Storm Shield, Water Walk with MPK, SOJ with MPK, a Rack with Random Slam, and a Ravenfrost, and a pair of Occultists still, with a very good inventory. I think for the Helm slot, Nightwing's Whale seems like the obvious choice playing a Cold Sorceress, but I like Shaker for MF. The damage difference is not as big as you thought it might be. As you can see, it's about 200 only, and for the 200 damage loss you get a decent chunk of MF, you get life, you get mana, and a bit of PDR. I'm sitting at just over 100 MF in this setup with Geats, Shaco, some small chumps. And I'm using Infinity on the Mercenary. You can definitely get by without an Infinity on this build. It would make it a lower priority than getting a good inventory. But at the very end, you'd like Infinity on the Mercenary. Again, still the same maps. You can definitely do tier 3s like Throne on this build if you want to, but as a hardcore player, I would much prefer to stick to tier 1s and tier 2s. Let's see how it performs in Wild Crypts. And here's a look at my other endgame mapping choice as a hardcore player for Sorceress, which is Chain Lightning. I have a very high-end gear here as well, but the setup looks very similar to the Cold Sorceress, except I'm using Griffins for the helm slot. I'm still using Oculus here. You could definitely use a Shooters. It just depends on what corruptions you have available. In this case, it's pretty hard to squeeze MF into this setup, so I like Oculus. But a Shooters with an MF slam could be very viable as well. But as you can see, my risks are not that overcapped, so the risks on Oculus is decent, as well as the mana per kill. And I don't really need the damage that much because I'm not trying to run max life tier 3s. It's the same maps as the Cold Sorceress pretty much, plus a few others. Your main map is probably going to be Ancestral Trial in the end.